The champagne glass slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the grand ballroom at the Riverside Country Club. Crystal fragments scattered across my sensible black shoes, the same shoes I'd worn to every family, gathering for the past 5 years because, as my daughter-in-law Linda always reminded me, "Eleanor, you don't want to draw attention to yourself." But now, every single person in that opulent room was staring at me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, bending down to collect the pieces, my arthritic hands shaking. "I'll clean this up. I'll pay for—" "Leave it," commanded a voice I didn't recognize. Strong, authoritative. "Someone else will handle that." I looked up to see James Morrison, father of the bride, towering over me in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. His wife Victoria stood behind him, her surgically enhanced face frozen in an expression of shock that had nothing to do with Botox. "Mrs. Wells?" James said again, and there was something in his voice that made my stomach drop. "Eleanor Wells, is that really you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire everyone could smell, but no one could see. Around our table, the one they'd stuck us at in the back corner, near the kitchen doors, my family had gone completely still. My son Robert's face had drained of all color. My daughter-in-law Linda's mouth hung open, a forkful of overpriced chicken halfway to her lips. Even my granddaughter Jessica had stopped taking selfies, her phone forgotten in her manicured hands. But it was my grandson Danny's expression that broke my heart. My sweet Danny, the groom, looking between his new father-in-law and me with complete confusion written across his young face. "Grandma Elle?" he said softly. "What's happening?" I couldn't answer him. Hell, I could barely breathe. Because James Morrison was looking at me like he'd seen a ghost. And maybe he had. The ghost of the woman I used to be. Before I became small and quiet and invisible. Before I learned to sit in corners and keep my opinions to myself and smile politely when people talked over me, or around me, or through me, like I wasn't even there. "You know my grandmother?" Danny asked his new father-in-law, and I could hear the bewilderment in his voice. Of course he was confused. In his mind, I was just Grandma Elle, the quiet old lady who brought casseroles to family dinners and knitted scarves for Christmas, and never had much to say about anything important. James Morrison never took his eyes off me. "Know her?" he repeated, his voice growing stronger, more certain with each word. "Son, your grandmother isn't just anyone. She's Eleanor Wells, the Eleanor Wells." The name hit the room like a physical force. Conversations at nearby tables began to falter and die as people turned to look. The band, which had been playing some forgettable pop song, seemed to sense the shift in energy and let their music trail off into uncertainty. "I don't understand," Sarah said, speaking for the first time since her father had approached our table. She was beautiful in her designer wedding gown, every inch the princess bride. But right now she looked like a little girl trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "Dad, what are you talking about?" James Morrison's eyes were bright with something between wonder and disbelief. "Sweetheart, do you remember when I told you about the case that made me want to become a lawyer? The Supreme Court case that changed everything I thought I knew about justice?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Morrison versus State, 1987. The case was named after my Uncle Pete, my father's younger brother. He was on death row for a murder he didn't commit, and every lawyer in Michigan had given up on him. Every lawyer except one." James turned back to me, and I saw tears beginning to form in his eyes. "Every lawyer except Eleanor Wells." The room had gone so quiet I could hear the ice melting in water glasses 3 tables away. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, sensing that something momentous was happening. "That's impossible," Robert said suddenly, his voice tight and strained. "My mother was never a lawyer. She worked for lawyers, maybe, did some secretarial work. But she wasn't. She couldn't have—" "Your mother," James Morrison interrupted, his voice cutting through Robert's stammering like a knife through paper. "Argued 6 cases before the United States Supreme Court. She won 5 of them. She changed the way evidence is handled in capital cases across this entire country. She saved my uncle's life, and in doing so, she saved the lives of hundreds of innocent people who came after him." The words landed like bombs in the silence. I watched my family's faces, saw the exact moment when the impossible became possible, when their comfortable assumptions about quiet, harmless Grandma Elle began to crumble. "Mom?" Robert's voice was barely above a whisper. "Is this true?" I looked at my son. This 47-year-old man who managed a chain of hardware stores and thought he understood everything about the world, and felt something crack open inside my chest. Something that had been locked away for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed. "Yes," I said, and my voice was steady in a way that surprised everyone, including myself. "It's true." The admission seemed to release something in the room. Conversations that had been frozen began to buzz back to life, but not the normal wedding chatter. This was different. Electric. People were pulling out phones, whispering urgently to each other, Googling my name. "Holy shit," Jessica breathed, then clapped a hand over her mouth as her parents shot her sharp looks. But her phone was already in her hand, her thumbs flying over the screen. "Grandma, you're on Wikipedia. You're actually on Wikipedia. It says here you graduated Harvard Law Review, summa cum laude. It says you worked for legal aid for 15 years before starting your own practice, specializing in wrongful convictions and constitutional law." She looked up at me with eyes wide with amazement. "It says you're considered one of the most influential civil rights lawyers of the 1980s and 90s. "That's enough, Jessica," Linda snapped, but her voice lacked its usual authority. She was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. "No," said James Morrison firmly. "It's not enough. Not nearly enough." He turned to address the room, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of commanding courtrooms and boardrooms. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need you all to understand something. The woman sitting at that table in the corner, the woman my new son-in-law's family apparently thinks is just a grandmother, is a legal legend." The room had gone completely silent again, but this was different from before. This wasn't the shocked silence of people witnessing a scene. This was the respectful quiet of people recognizing they were in the presence of greatness. James Morrison was just getting started. In 1985, my uncle Pete Morrison was 26 years old, married to his high school sweetheart, working as a mechanic in Detroit. He was also sitting on death row for the murder of a convenience store clerk, a murder he didn't commit. The evidence against him was circumstantial at best, but his court-appointed attorney was fresh out of law school and overwhelmed. Pete had 6 weeks to live when his case landed on Eleanor Wells's desk at the Michigan Legal Aid Society. I could feel every eye in the room on me, but for the first time in 20 years, I didn't want to disappear. I didn't want to make myself smaller because James Morrison was telling my story, our story, and he was telling it right. "Most lawyers would have looked at that case and seen a lost cause," James continued. "The physical evidence was contaminated. Key witnesses had disappeared. The police investigation was sloppy at best, corrupt at worst. But Eleanor Wells didn't see a lost cause. She saw an innocent man who was going to die unless someone fought for him. My hands were no longer shaking. For the first time in decades, I felt steady, centered, like I was remembering how to breathe properly. "She fought for 3 years," James said, his voice growing stronger with each word. 3 years of 18-hour days, sleeping in her office, mortgaging her house to fund investigations the state should have done. She tracked down witnesses who had been intimidated into silence. She found evidence that had been buried or ignored. She rebuilt my uncle's entire case from the ground up. And she did it all pro bono, added a voice from across the room. An elderly man I didn't recognize had stood up at one of the front tables. "I'm retired Judge Harold Brennan, Federal District Court. I presided over 2 of Mrs. Wells's supreme court cases. She never took a dime from clients who couldn't afford to pay. Never. Not once." James Morrison nodded gratefully at the judge. "She took Morrison versus State all the way to the Supreme Court, and she won. Not just for my uncle, but for every wrongfully convicted person in America. The precedent she set, the Morrison Standard, requires prosecutors to turn over all potentially exculpatory evidence to the defense, even if they believe it's irrelevant. Do you know how many innocent people have been saved because of that ruling?" He looked around the room, making eye contact with person after person. "Hundreds, maybe thousands. And it all started because one lawyer was willing to fight for a mechanic from Detroit that everyone else had written off." "What happened? To your uncle?" Sarah asked softly. James smiled, and for the first time since this all began, it was a purely happy expression. "He lived. He got married. To that high school sweetheart who waited for him through everything. Had 3 kids, 7 grandchildren. He worked as a mechanic for another 30 years, volunteered at the local literacy center, coached Little League. He died 5 years ago, surrounded by family, in his own bed, at the age of 78. Tears were flowing freely down my cheeks now, but I didn't care. "I remember him," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room. "Peter Morrison. He had the gentlest hands I'd ever seen on a man that size, calloused from years of working on engines, but so careful when he'd shake hands or touch his wife's face. He used to stutter when he got nervous." "He did," James confirmed, his own voice thick with emotion. "Right up until the day he died, except when he talked about you. When Pete talked about Eleanor Wells, the woman who saved his life, his voice was clear as a bell. The silence that followed was profound, sacred almost. And then, from somewhere in the back of the room, someone started clapping, slow, respectful applause that was picked up by another person, then another, until the entire room was on their feet, applauding me. Me, Eleanor Wells. The woman my own family had been treating like a slightly dotty old lady who needed to be managed and humored and kept quietly in corners where she couldn't embarrass anyone. "Please," I said, standing slowly, my arthritic joints protesting, but my spine straight for the first time in years. "Please, sit down." The applause died away, but people remained standing, waiting. I looked at my family, at Robert and Linda, and Jessica and Danny, and saw a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been shame written across their faces. "I want to tell you about Peter Morrison," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned in courtrooms across the country. "Not because I want to relive old glory, but because you need to understand what it means to fight for someone when the whole world has given up on them." I walked slowly to the center of the room, past tables full of people I'd never met, but who were looking at me with respect I hadn't felt in decades. When I first met Pete, he was so broken down by the system that he could barely look me in the eye, 3 years on death row will do that to a man, especially an innocent man. He'd been beaten down by guards, abandoned by lawyers, written off by society. He told me later that when I walked into that prison conference room in my cheap suit and my determined expression, he thought I was just another do-gooder who would disappear as soon as things got difficult. I could see Danny hanging on every word, his face a mixture of amazement and something that looked like pride. When was the last time anyone in my family had looked at me like that? But Pete was wrong about me giving up, just like he was wrong about a lot of things. See? I'd been fighting my whole life, fighting to get into Harvard Law when they barely admitted women, fighting to be taken seriously in courtrooms where judges would ask if I was there to take notes for the real lawyer, fighting to build a practice that mattered. I wasn't about to stop fighting for someone who needed it more than I'd ever needed anything. I looked directly at James Morrison. Your uncle was innocent, Mr. Morrison. But more than that, he was worth fighting for. They all were. Every client I ever represented, every case I ever took. Because that's what the law is supposed to be about. Not just rules and precedents and billable hours. It's supposed to be about justice, about making sure that the truth has a chance to come out even when it's inconvenient or expensive or difficult. How many cases did you take to the Supreme Court? Asked Judge Brennan. 6, I replied. Won 5, lost 1. The one I lost still keeps me up at night sometimes. Which one? Someone called out. I hesitated. It had been years since I'd talked about Marcus Williams, the case that broke my heart and, in many ways, broke my spirit. Williams versus Alabama, I said finally. 1994. Marcus Williams was 19 years old, mentally disabled, coerced into confessing to a rape he didn't commit. I had DNA evidence that would have exonerated him, but the court ruled it inadmissible on a technicality. Marcus died in prison 2 years later. He was 21. The room was completely silent again. The DNA evidence was later tested. I continued, my voice steady despite the pain. Marcus was innocent, just like I knew he was. But I failed him. I couldn't find the right legal argument, couldn't convince 5 justices that justice mattered more than procedure. That failure taught me something important about the law and about myself. What was that? Sarah asked softly. I looked at this young woman, this bride who was supposed to be the center of attention at her own wedding, but who was instead listening to an old woman tell stories about cases from decades ago. It taught me that winning isn't everything, but fighting is. Even when you lose, even when the system fails, even when good people die because bad people make bad decisions, you keep fighting. Because every fight matters, every case matters, every client matters. I turned back to my family, seeing them with new eyes, seeing myself with new eyes. For 20 years I've been sitting quietly in corners, letting people treat me like my mind retired when my body did. I've let my own family dismiss my opinions, ignore my experience, act like I was just some harmless old lady who needed to be managed and protected from the world. Robert started to speak, but I held up a hand. I'm not finished, I said, and there was steel in my voice that had been absent for 2 decades. I let it happen because I was tired, bone-deep, soul-deep tired from fighting for 30 years. When you started treating me like I was fragile, Robert, part of me was grateful. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to prove myself worthy of being heard. Tears were streaming down Robert's face now. Mom, But I was wrong, I continued. We were both wrong. You took away my voice, but I gave it up. You diminished me, but I let myself be diminished. And in doing so, we cheated everyone. Your children, your grandchildren, everyone who might have benefited from what I know, what I've learned, what I've experienced. I looked at Danny, my grandson, this young man who was about to start his own adult life. "You're starting law school in the fall?" I said to him. He nodded, still looking stunned. "What kind of law do you want to practice?" I was thinking corporate law," he said uncertainly. "Dad says that's where the money is." I smiled, and it felt like the first real smile I'd worn in years. "Money's important, Danny, but it's not everything. Let me tell you what's everything. Walking into a prison and looking into the eyes of a man who's been abandoned by the world and telling him that you believe him, that you're going to fight for him. That's everything." "But Grandma," Danny said, his voice small, "I'm not sure I'm brave enough for that kind of law." "Brave enough?" I laughed, and the sound surprised everyone, including myself. "Danny, bravery isn't about not being scared. Bravery is about being terrified and doing what's right anyway. I was scared every single day for 30 years. Scared of losing. Scared of failing my clients. Scared of not being good enough or smart enough or tough enough. But I did it anyway, because someone had to." I looked around the room, at all these people who had spent the evening getting to know me, as Robert's quiet mother, Danny's unassuming grandmother, the old lady in the corner who didn't have much to say. "I want to tell you all something," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "Getting old doesn't mean getting irrelevant. Retiring doesn't mean disappearing. And being someone's grandmother doesn't mean you stop being yourself." The applause that followed was different from before. This wasn't polite recognition. This was celebration. This was a room full of people who had just witnessed someone remember who they were. James Morrison approached me again, but this time there was no shock in his expression, just deep, profound respect. "Mrs. Wells," he said, "I run a law firm with 63 attorneys. We handle everything from corporate mergers to civil rights cases. I would be honored, deeply honored, if you would consider consulting with us on some of our pro bono work, particularly our death penalty cases." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed. "I'm 73 years old," I said. "So," James replied, "your mind is clearly as sharp as ever. Your experience is invaluable. And based on what I've witnessed tonight, your passion for justice hasn't dimmed one bit." I looked at Robert, saw the mixture of pride and shame and hope in his expression. Looked at Linda, who was crying quietly into her napkin. At Jessica, who was still scrolling through articles about me on her phone with amazement. At Danny, who was looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "That's all I can ask," James replied. "But Mrs. Wells, don't think too long. The world needs ELEANOR Wells. It always has." As the reception continued around us, as the band started playing again, and conversations resumed and people began to process what they had just witnessed, I sat back down at my corner table. But I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel invisible. For the first time in 20 years, I felt like myself. "Grandma Elle?" Danny said softly, sliding his chair closer to mine. "Yes, sweetheart." "Will you help me with law school? Will you teach me about constitutional law and Supreme Court cases and what it really means to fight for people?" I reached over and took his hand, this young man's smooth, unmarked hand in my weathered, arthritic one. "I would love that," I said. "But fair warning, I don't take it easy on my students. Danny grinned. "I'm counting on it. I want to learn from the best. The best. After 20 years of being just a retired grandma, I was ready to be the best again." Around the room, people were still talking about what had happened, still processing the revelation of who I really was. Some were taking pictures, others were sharing stories on social media. I knew that by tomorrow, this wedding would be remembered not for the flowers or the food, or even the bride and groom, but for the moment when Eleanor Wells remembered she was Eleanor Wells, and that was exactly as it should be. What do you think about Eleanor's incredible revelation? Have you ever felt invisible or underestimated because of your age? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The minutes following my revelation felt like living in a snow globe that someone had just shaken. Everything was swirling, settling into new patterns, and I was at the center of it all, watching my world rearrange itself in real time. Jessica was the first to break the spell that had fallen over our table. "Grandma," she said, her voice filled with a wonder I hadn't heard since she was small. "I've been reading about you this whole time. Do you know there's a law review article from Georgetown called The Wells Doctrine: How One Woman's Determination Reshaped Constitutional Protections for the Accused?" She held up her phone, scrolling rapidly. "And look at this. There's a whole Wikipedia page about Morrison v. State. It says the case is taught in every constitutional law class in the country. Every single one, Grandma. Law students across America know your name." I felt something twist in my chest, pride mixed with a deep, aching sadness. "I used to get letters," I said quietly. "From law students, young lawyers, people who'd read about the case. They'd write to thank me, to ask for advice, to tell me they'd been inspired to go into civil rights law because of what we accomplished." "What happened to the letters?" Danny asked. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mom, you never mentioned any letters." "I tried to," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Remember about 5 years ago, when that package came from Yale Law School? It was their annual report, and they'd written about Morrison versus State in their section on landmark alumni achievements. I tried to show it to you, tried to explain what it meant, but you said I was probably just on some mailing list by mistake." The color drained from Robert's face. "Oh, God. Mom, I remember that. I threw it away. I thought it was junk mail." The confession hung in the air like a physical thing. Around us, the wedding reception continued. Servers clearing dinner plates, the band transitioning into their dancing set, guests beginning to move around and mingle. But at our table, time seemed frozen. "You threw it away," I repeated, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. "I didn't know," Robert said, his voice breaking. "Mom, I swear to God I didn't know. I thought you were getting confused, maybe mixing up stories you'd heard with things you thought you'd done. I was trying to protect you from what?" The question came out sharper than I intended. "From what, Robert?" He looked around the table helplessly, seeking support from Linda, from Jessica, from anyone. But they were all staring at him, with expressions ranging from shock to disappointment. "From embarrassing yourself," he said finally, the words barely audible. I thought maybe the memories weren't reliable anymore. And I didn't want you to get confused in front of people and feel bad about it later. The honesty of it, the terrible, misguided honesty, was almost worse than if he'd been deliberately cruel. So, when I tried to tell you about my cases, about my work, about the most important things I'd ever done in my life, I said slowly, You decided I was suffering from some kind of cognitive decline? Mom, please. And rather than actually listening to me, rather than asking questions or doing even the most basic research to verify what I was telling you, you decided it would be kinder to just dismiss me? Robert was crying now, tears streaming down his face. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I don't know how to. I can't. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. The profanity seemed to surprise him as much as it did the rest of us. Robert was a careful man, a proper man who minded his language and his appearance and what people thought of him. But right now he looked broken in a way I'd never seen before. Linda reached across the table and took my hand. Eleanor, I'm sorry, too. I should have questioned it. I should have asked you directly instead of just going along with Robert's assumptions. You all should have, I said, but there was no anger in my voice anymore. Just a deep, bone-deep sadness for all the years we'd lost, all the conversations we'd never had, all the ways we'd failed each other. But I should have fought harder, too. I should have insisted on being heard. Why didn't you? Jessica asked, and there was no judgment in her voice, just genuine curiosity. I mean, you fought the Supreme Court and won. Why couldn't you fight? Dad! It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for the past hour. Because, I said slowly, fighting in court is different from fighting your family. In court, there are rules. Evidence matters. Logic matters. Truth matters. But families run on emotion and assumption, and years of ingrained patterns. And I was so tired, Jessica. So tired of fighting for everything all the time. I looked at each of them in turn. When your father started treating me like I was fragile, like I needed to be protected from the world, part of me was grateful. For the first time in my adult life, someone else was taking charge. Someone else was making decisions. I didn't have to be strong or brilliant or formidable. I could just be quiet. But you weren't happy, Danny observed. No, I admitted. I wasn't happy. But I wasn't miserable either, not at first. I was just absent from my own life, from my own mind. And by the time I realized what I'd given up, it felt too late to get it back. James Morrison, who had been standing nearby talking quietly with his wife and several other guests, approached our table again. Mrs. Wells, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but there's someone here who very much wants to meet you. He gestured to an elderly black woman who was making her way slowly across the dance floor with the aid of a walker. She was impeccably dressed in a deep purple dress and pearls, her silver hair styled in an elegant updo. Despite her obvious physical frailty, her eyes were sharp and bright. Mrs. Wells, James said as the woman reached our table, I'd like you to meet Dr. Althea Washington. Dr. Washington, this is Eleanor Wells. The name hit me like lightning. Althea Washington, I breathed. Dear God, you're Marcus Williams' aunt. Dr. Washington's face broke into a smile that was equal parts joy and sorrow. You remember? I could never forget. I stood up quickly, my chair scraping against the floor. Dr. Washington, I am so sorry. I failed Marcus. I failed you. I should have found a way. Stop. Her voice was gentle but firm. Just stop right there. She reached out and took both of my hands in hers. You didn't fail anybody. You fought for my nephew when nobody else would. You believed him when nobody else did. You gave him hope in the last years of his life, and you gave our family the truth about what happened to him. Tears were streaming down my face. But I couldn't save him." "No," she said simply. "You couldn't. But honey, you tried. You tried with everything you had. And that matters. That matters more than you know." She looked around the table at my family, who were watching this exchange with expressions of amazement and growing understanding. "I've been following your career for 30 years," Dr. Washington continued. "After Marcus died, I made it my business to know what Eleanor Wells was doing, who she was helping, what cases she was winning. Do you know how many innocent people are alive today because of the precedents you set? Do you know how many families got their loved ones back because you changed the law?" I shook my head, unable to speak. "Hundreds," she said firmly. "Maybe thousands. Marcus's death was a tragedy, but his case, and your fight for him, led to changes in how evidence is preserved and presented. You couldn't save my nephew, but you saved so many others." She paused, studying my face with those sharp, intelligent eyes. "What I want to know," she said, "is what the hell you've been doing with yourself for the past 20 years. The question? Blunt and direct and completely unexpected. Startled a laugh out of me. "I've been sitting quietly in corners, apparently." "Well, that's a damn waste," Dr. Washington said matter-of-factly. "Begging your pardon for the language, but it's the truth. The world needs Eleanor Wells. It always has." She turned to address my family directly. "I don't know what's been going on here, but I can see that some of you are just now learning who this woman really is. Let me tell you something. Eleanor Wells is a warrior. She's a champion for people who don't have champions. She's fought battles that lesser lawyers wouldn't even attempt, and she's won more often than not." Dr. Washington's voice grew stronger, more commanding. "I taught sociology at Northwestern for 42 years. I've met presidents and senators and Supreme Court justices, but Eleanor Wells is one of the most remarkable people I have ever known. And if you've been treating her like anything less than that, then shame on you." The rebuke was delivered with such dignity and authority that even Robert seemed to shrink in his chair. "Now," Dr. Washington continued, turning back to me, "I want to know what you're going to do next, because sitting quietly in corners is not an option anymore." Before I could answer, another voice interrupted us. "Eleanor? Eleanor Wells?" I turned to see a man in his 60s approaching our table. He was well-dressed but not ostentatious, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I heard James Morrison say your name, and I had to come over. I'm David Chen. I was Marcus Williams's cellmate for the last 6 months of his life." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Marcus Williams had been dead for 26 years. But somehow the people whose lives had been touched by his case, by my failure to save him, were materializing around me like ghosts made flesh. "David Chen," I whispered, "you wrote me letters. After Marcus died, you wrote me letters." He nodded. "You answered everyone. Do you remember what you told me in your last letter?" I closed my eyes, reaching back through the decades. "I told you that Marcus's death wasn't the end of the story, that every person who fights for justice carries forward the memory of those we couldn't save." "That's right," David said softly. "And do you remember what else you told me?" I opened my eyes and looked at him. This man who had shared my client's final months, who had witnessed his hope and his despair and his quiet dignity in the face of an unjust death. "I told you to live a life that would make Marcus proud." "And I did," David said, his voice growing stronger. "I got out of prison 3 years after Marcus died. I went to community college, then to state school. I became a social worker. I've spent the last 20 years working with juvenile offenders, trying to keep kids from ending up where Marcus and I ended up. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn, folded piece of paper. I've carried your last letter with me for 26 years. Do you want to know why? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Because in that letter, you made me a promise. You said that as long as you were alive, as long as you had breath in your body and fight in your heart, you would keep working for justice. You said that Marcus's death would not be in vain if people like you and me refused to give up. He held up the letter. I've kept my part of that promise, Eleanor. What about you? The question hung in the air like a challenge, like a summons, like a call to arms that I'd been ignoring for 20 years. I stopped. I said quietly. I stopped fighting. I stopped believing that what I did mattered. I let myself become invisible. Why? The question came from Danny, my grandson, who was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Like he was seeing me not as his grandmother, but as a person, a whole and complex human being with a history and a purpose and a calling. Because I was afraid, I said, the admission coming out of me like a confession. Afraid of failing again, afraid of losing another Marcus, afraid of not being good enough or smart enough or strong enough to make a difference. But you did make a difference, Dr. Washington interjected. Every case you won, every precedent you set, every innocent person who walked free because of your work. That was a difference, a real, tangible, life-changing difference. I know, I said. I know that intellectually, but in here, I pressed a hand to my chest. All I could feel was Marcus's death. All I could remember was standing in that courtroom and watching 5 justices decide that a technicality mattered more than a young man's life. David Chen stepped closer, and I could see tears in his eyes. Eleanor, can I tell you something Marcus said to me the night before he died? I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. He said he was grateful. Grateful that someone had believed him, grateful that someone had fought for him, grateful that his case might help other people someday. He said Eleanor Wells had given him something more valuable than freedom. She'd given him dignity. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had to sit down, my legs suddenly unable to support me. He knew he was going to die, David continued, but he wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry at you. He was proud that his lawyer had been someone who cared enough to fight for the truth, even when the system failed. I buried my face in my hands, 26 years of grief and guilt and regret pouring out of me in great shuddering sobs. Around the table, my family sat in stunned silence, finally beginning to understand not just who I had been, but what I had carried, what I had lost, what I had given up. When I finally looked up, half the wedding reception seemed to be gathered around our table. Word had spread, through whispered conversations, through frantic Google searches, through the kind of viral social media sharing that can transform a quiet moment into a public revelation. Mrs. Wells? Said a young woman I didn't recognize. She looked to be in her late 20s, professionally dressed despite the evening hour. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm Sarah Martinez, investigative reporter for the Detroit Free Press. I've been covering wrongful conviction cases for 5 years, and your name comes up in my research constantly. The Morrison Standard, the Williams Protocol, the Wells Doctrine. Your work is the foundation for everything we do in this field today. She paused, looking around at the crowd that had gathered. I have to ask, Why haven't we heard from you? In 20 years? Where have you been?" The question was blunt, journalistic, cutting straight to the heart of things. And for the first time all evening, I had a clear, honest answer. "I've been hiding," I said simply. "Hiding from the weight of what I'd done and what I'd failed to do. Hiding from the responsibility of being Eleanor Wells. Hiding from the knowledge that people were counting on me to keep fighting, and I didn't think I had any fight left." I stood up slowly, looking around at all these faces. Family members, who were seeing me clearly for the first time. Strangers who knew my work better than my own son did. People whose lives had been touched by cases I'd handled decades ago. "But I'm done hiding," I said, my voice carrying across the ballroom with an authority I hadn't felt in 20 years. "David, you asked me if I'd kept my promise to Marcus. The answer is no. I broke that promise 20 years ago, and I've been breaking it every day since." I looked directly at James Morrison. "Mr. Morrison, you offered me a position consulting on death penalty cases." He nodded. "The offer stands." "Then I accept," I said. "Because David is right. Dr. Washington is right. Marcus Williams died because I couldn't save him. But hundreds of other people are alive today because of the precedents his case helped establish. And there are more people out there, more Marcuses, more Peters, who need someone to fight for. Them!" The applause that erupted was spontaneous and thunderous. But this time, I didn't ask them to stop. This time, I stood in the center of it all and let myself feel what I should have been feeling for 20 years. Pride, purpose, the bone deep. Satisfaction of knowing exactly who I was and what I was meant to do. When the applause finally died down, Jessica stood up and raised her champagne glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," she said, her young voice carrying surprising authority. "To my grandmother, Eleanor Wells, who taught me tonight that it's never too late to remember who you really are." The toast rippled across the ballroom as guests raised their glasses, but it was Danny's words that broke my heart and put it back together again. "To Grandma L," he said softly, just for our table to hear. "Who's going to teach me that being a lawyer isn't about making money? It's about making a difference." As the evening wound down and guests began to filter out of the ballroom, I found myself surrounded by business cards, phone numbers, invitations to speak at law schools and bar associations and civil rights organizations. The quiet retirement I'd been living for 20 years had ended in a single evening, replaced by a future that suddenly seemed full of possibility. "Mom," Robert said as we waited for the valet to bring the car around. "I need to ask you something." I turned to face my son, this middle-aged man who had spent the evening discovering that his mother was a stranger. "Are you angry at me?" he asked. "For what I did, for how I treated you." I considered the question seriously. Was I angry? I certainly had every right to be. But looking at Robert's face, seeing the genuine remorse there, the dawning understanding of what he had cost both of us, I found that anger wasn't what I felt. "I'm disappointed," I said finally, "in both of us. You for not listening, and me for not insisting on being heard. But anger? No, I don't have time for anger anymore." "What do you mean?" I looked up at the stars, barely visible above the city lights, but still there, still shining. "I mean, I'm 73 years old, and I've wasted 20 years being small and quiet and invisible. I don't have 20 more years to waste on resentment or regret." I turned back to him. "What I have is whatever time is left to me, and I intend to use every minute of it to be Eleanor Wells again. The real Eleanor Wells. The one who fights for people who can't fight for themselves. Robert nodded slowly. Would you let me help? I know I don't understand your world, but maybe I could learn. The offer surprised me, but not as much as my immediate desire to accept it. I'd like that, I said. But you have to understand. This isn't going to be easy. The cases I take, the people I represent, they're going to challenge everything. You think you know about justice and fairness and how the world works. I want to be challenged, he said quickly. I want to understand who my mother really is. As the valet brought our car around, I looked back at the Riverside Country Club, where my grandson's wedding reception was finally winding down. 6 hours ago, I had walked into that ballroom as just another grandmother in a cheap dress, invisible and ignored. I was leaving as Eleanor Wells, constitutional lawyer, civil rights advocate, and the woman who had just remembered that she still had work to do. The transformation wasn't complete. It would take time to rebuild the confidence I'd lost, to reconnect with the legal community I'd abandoned, to figure out exactly what the next chapter of my life would look like. But for the first time in 20 years, I knew who I was again, and that was everything.